Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have invoked the Emergencies Act. This is the reformed War Measures Act that gives the federal government and police sweeping and never-before-used powers. Let's acknowledge what's happened. The Emergency Act suspends civil liberties. I said earlier this week, this is a deep stain on our country's reputation as a defender of rights, and that dictators around the world would be delighted with Canada. Government MPs scoffed when I said that in the House of Commons. For if Canada does this, who could say tyrants, with protesters in their capital cities, could not do the same? It wasn't long until we heard answers. China's state media was first, declaring Beijing had greater moral and legal authority to invoke its national securities law in Hong Kong than Canada did against its truckers. Russia Today served up outsized reporting, 4 times that of BBC and Al Jazeera, to gin up its viewers. And the best, by best, Mr. Speaker, I mean the worst, was Iran's former leader, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, tweeting out support. Oh, Canada, what horrible company for our nation to keep, with Beijing, Moscow, Tehran cheering on the Liberal government. It must feel a little uncomfortable where Liberal, NDP, and possibly Green MPs sit. While the street blockade had to be resolved in Ottawa, the conditions to invoke the Emergencies Act have not been met. This is why I will vote to repeal this dreadful infringement by the federal government. Should most other MPs vote to endorse the Prime Minister's use of force, they will set a very, very low bar on future governments to suspend civil liberties. What should concern us, particularly opposition MPs, willing to support the government's motion, is the test to invoke the Emergencies Act in the future will be today's feeble justifications. Here is the actual requirement. A national emergency is an urgent, temporary, and critical situation that seriously endangers the health and safety of Canadians that cannot be effectively dealt with by provinces or territories, or that seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. It must be a situation that cannot be effectively dealt with by any other law of Canada. Unlawful blockades in Surrey, Coutts, Windsor were dispersed prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Should Parliament label protesters on Wellington and its surrounding streets in Ottawa as a genuine national emergency, a future government could easily find others. Another protest outside Parliament, illegal immigration, eco-radicalism. Lawmakers should be careful which path they lead our country. The members opposite who would support this motion affix their names to it in perpetuity. They will authorize and endorse the suspension of constitutional rights. Government members argue civil liberties are not infringed because the Emergencies Act preamble says charter rights are protected. Yet, prohibiting public assembly is an infringement on civil liberties. Seizing private property without due process is an infringement on civil liberties. Withholding assets without the right to recourse is an infringement on civil liberties. Freezing bank accounts and forcing banks to share private information with security agencies without any court oversight or even criminal charges being laid is a gross violation of fundamental rights. Limiting travel is an infringement on civil liberties. There are over 100 police checkpoints in our nation's capital. Today's invocation of the Emergency Act is an out-of-proportion use of federal powers. Are MPs opposite going to vote to endorse this unwarranted withdrawal of civil liberties? The government's actions, along with those of the police, will be studied and analyzed for decades to come by academics, researchers, and students, just as the Draconian War Measure Act had been for the last 50 years. I don't believe their judgment will be a pleasant one. Indeed, I'm already struck by the large and growing divergence in perspectives and reporting on this matter by our domestic media and foreign press. Canada's media and elite opinion, albeit with some exceptions in both camps, have largely echoed the government's position. They say Ottawa protesters aren't peaceful while downplaying the suspension of rights. Some simply parrot the government line. Others dismiss the legitimate concerns Canadians have about lockdowns, mandates, and restrictions. What we don't see is a full-throated defense of charter freedoms from Liberal reporters and opinion pundits who we look for when rights are curtailed at home or abroad. This is in sharp contrast to foreign reporting. So what exactly is being reported beyond our borders? Mr. Speaker, I'm going to cite some of that coverage. A Newsweek editor wrote midweek, "Canada is arresting dissidents. A country that considers itself a democracy arresting people for the crime of organizing a mass grassroots nonviolent protest should horrify us." The Economist, which has long celebrated Canada's Liberals in its pages, wrote, "The Prime Minister's crackdown on protests could make things worse. Canada's government should have drawn a clear distinction between harmful acts and obnoxious or foolish words. Peaceful protests are fine. Blocking crucial highways so that others cannot go about their business is not. This is a clear distinction between border points and Wellington Street protest." The Economist continues, "The truckers have every right to express their disagreement. A wise government would have listened to them and responded politely, taking their complaints seriously, but the Liberal Prime Minister has done the opposite." Another respectable British magazine, The Spectator, was much more harsh, writing, "Peaceful civil disobedience is an established means of drawing attention to injustice when ordinary means of recourse have been exhausted. Canada's elites are fixating on the presence of truckers in the capital and at the borders only as a national embarrassment. They aren't interested in hearing about the impact of the mandates on citizens' lives. It has not been possible for the truckers and their supporters to have their grievances addressed by ordinary civic means. This civil disobedience is all the Prime Minister can cite in justification of the Emergency Act. The government rationale is that ongoing protests and peaceful civil disobedience constitute a threat to national security and to the economy. A credible government would have avoided this situation entirely by addressing or at least expressing a willingness to evaluate the suffering it is inflicting on its own people." The title of this provocative article is "The PM's Totalitarian Turn," but its conclusion is identical of that of the Liberal Economist magazine, along with Europe's Financial Times, which is, "The government of Canada got it wrong." And it goes on in other publications. The New York Times asserted Monday, "Canada declares national emergency, allowing temporary suspension of civil liberties." Ottawa-based reporters didn't like that, or the Times included coverage as well as photos of police arresting protesters near our Parliament yesterday at gunpoint. The Wall Street Journal, which is the largest U.S. newspaper, editorialized, the truckers' protests could have been handled without abusing the law. Government's job is to maintain public order while respecting civil liberties. Canada has failed on both scores. The Foreign Press conclusion, our Prime Minister crossed a democratic line. Canadians want the blockade to end, but it never should have come at the expense of the rule of law. Crackdowns, abuse, totalitarian methods in Canada, say Western press. Oh, Canada, that's a deep, deep stain and national embarrassment. Mr. Speaker, I miss my Canada, but some hope. The Wall Street Journal's editorial offers a warning and perhaps a way out, writing, "Protesters aren't emergencies, and Western leaders had better get used to handling civil disobedience firmly without traducing civil liberties." Mr. Speaker, how should Parliament respond? The only question before us is, does this legislative body support trampling civil disobedience in protest by undermining rights and freedoms? We cannot undo what has happened. Invoking the Emergencies Act is on the Prime Minister and his Liberal cabinet. But we don't need to be culpable. We can stop it. Parliament can act. We must not approve our juvenile Prime Minister's decision in gross misuse of federal law. Parliament can reject the Emergencies Act. It should. Because Canadians, along with the rest of the world, is watching, seeing if we will get it right.
Question et commentaire. Questions and comments. The